Tony Blair en ik kennen elkaar al enkele jaren, hebben lange en korte gesprekken met elkaar gevoerd. Ik ben een groot bewonderaar van hem geweest, vooral hoe hij de stijl van politiek bedrijven vernieuwde. Ik heb ook veel kritiek op hem gehad, bijvoorbeeld als het ging om Irak. En over al die onderwerpen gaan we het met elkaar hebben. Tony, welcome to the Netherlands, and great you've made some time available to speak with us today about your career in active politics, the years after, whether it was difficult to say goodbye or not. And I guess the first question I have to ask you is there a life after politics?
Well, it's important, Wouter, for you to know that there is.
Well, that's a relief. Thank you very much.
No, but for sure, actually. I really love my new life. You know, I spend obviously a lot of time in the Middle East and the peace process. I have a foundation that's about bringing the different faiths together, about peaceful coexistence between people of different faiths, and I do work in Africa, which is and I do some business work too. So I have a varied and interesting life, and I still get up every morning with a sense of purpose, which is the main thing.
But it must have been difficult to leave active politics nonetheless. I mean, you were one of the most powerful people in the world for about 10 years. There was the glamour, the media attention, the power. It must have been difficult.
Yeah, but as you know, these things have an appeal that can diminish over time, I think.
There was the glamour, the glamorous people. I mean, it wasn't all that addictive? Wasn't it difficult to leave all that behind?
Well, you left it.
Yeah, well, that's why I ask. Because I did find it difficult to leave it behind.
But you did. And I think, in the end, if you're a reasonably balanced human being and you've got a family life and a life where you also believe that there are things you can do outside of the traditional office of politics, then, I think the world's interesting today. If you take Al Gore, I would say Al Gore's probably made more impression since leaving office than in office. I don't think you have to be in the centre of politics. Now, yes, when the financial crisis was raging, I felt a sort of, I'd like to be there. Yeah. But otherwise, no, it's important to realise.
Is there anything or anybody you miss?
I miss the people I worked with closely. I mean, some of them I work with still, but that sense of a team for a purpose and the leadership around that, sometimes I miss.
Do you miss the Queen?
Look, I had a very good and close
There's only
relationship.
one correct answer to this, isn't there?
And of course I do in that sense, but you realise when you take the position that you leave. That's the end of that chapter.
Whenever people talk or write about your style of politics, they will also always pay attention to the fact that you seem to be surrounded very often by famous and glamorous people who did not earn their living in politics, like pop stars or movie stars. We've heard the stories about the Gallagher brothers, Oasis, Kevin Keegan, 29 headers up and down, if I remember correctly, Steven Spielberg. How important was it to you to be with those people? Bono, of course.
Actually, funny enough, it's very exaggerated, this, in a way. I mean, it's not that I think there's anything wrong with mixing with those people, but if you, I mean, as you know in politics, Wouter, if you get a photograph with a famous person, you might meet them once. And in my case, for example, I met once the guys from Oasis. Okay, that's it. Forevermore, the picture's there, and the picture's reproduced, and before you know where you are, people think you're hanging around with them every weekend.
Well, so I was a fan, so I was jealous, basically. That's why I asked the question.
No, the one person I guess I probably did have a lot to do with was Bono because of the, but that was because of Africa, not rock music in a sense. Right. And one of the treats about being a prime minister is, I remember the first time I met Paul McCartney and him saying to me, I was really keen to meet you. And I would say, don't be ridiculous. Yeah. You were my hero that I idolized when I was younger.
Now one of them who you mention in your book and who you write about is actually Steven Spielberg. You met him, I don't know how often you met him, but you actually spent quite some words in your book on one of the movies he made, Schindler's List, and a particular scene from that movie. Could you describe that scene to us?
Yeah, the scene in the movie is where the camp commandant, the Nazi who runs the camp, is with his girlfriend. His girlfriend's berating him, and then he gets up to go to the bathroom, and she's sort of shouting at him and so on, and then he just takes up a gun and kills one of the inmates, and it's just an incredibly evocative scene, you know, in the book, because there is, he has this power of life and death over people which he just exercises casually almost. And there is she having this otherwise normal relationship between a person and their lover. And I think it's, you know, it's a brilliant film, and it made a deep impression on me.
Would you be willing to read to us what you actually wrote about that particular scene?
Yeah, sure. Which is the paragraph here?
Which is from there to there.
Yeah. Why were the Nazis able to do these things? Because of people like him? No, because of people like her. She was in the next room. She was proximate. The responsibility seems, therefore, more proximate too. But what of the situations we know about, but we are not proximate to? What of the murder distant from us, the injustice we cannot see, the pain we cannot witness, but which we nonetheless know is out there? We know what is happening, proximate or not. In that case, we are not bystanders either. If we know and we fail to act, we are responsible. A few months later, that's after seeing the film, Rwanda erupted in genocide. We knew, we failed to act, we were responsible.
This isn't about Rwanda, is it? It is about Iraq.
It's about foreign policy as a whole. I mean, it's not specifically about Iraq, actually, but it is about the concept, the foreign policy concept, if you like.
The basic principle underlying foreign policy cannot be that if there is injustice somewhere, we've got to act. I mean, the world is more complex than that.
It is more complex.
And you're not capable of dealing with all injustice.
That is also true. It is more complex. We are not incapable of dealing with every injustice. But it should still be, there should be something of a call to us, nonetheless. Sometimes you can't answer that call. Sometimes the complexity is too great. Sometimes, you know, what is happening is too difficult for us to stop. But I think that call to action should always be there, answered or not.
And how important was this call to your decision to side with George Bush and to militarily intervene in Iraq?
That was really, I mean, obviously, you feel a sense of moral revulsion at how Saddam governed Iraq and the people that died there, but really this was more to do with security in the end. And it's important always to explain what it was that was going on in my mind at this time, and I try to do this in the book, is that really what changed me after September the 11th is the calculus of risk. Right. So my view was that after September the 11th, and I still feel this today, I feel this about Iran, incidentally, today, and the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran. I just think today, after September the 11th, after the fact that they killed 3,000 people in one day, but they could have killed 30,000, or they would have killed 300,000 if they could have. And I think from that moment on, my attitude certainly towards this whole issue to do with proliferation of nuclear, chemical, biological weapons changed from that moment. And the reason, of course, we identified Iraq was because they were the country that had used these weapons and been in breach of the UN resolutions. So that was what altered for me. And in a sense, I was at that point in the mood of saying to these countries, and you know, we had the same interaction with Libya in a way, you know, change or be changed. Now, in the case of Libya, Gaddafi changed, right? They gave up their...
But I don't think there was so much disagreement about whether the Hussein regime was unjust or not. I mean, the real question was whether going to war was actually the appropriate means to end that injustice. And others thought that there were still possibilities, peaceful possibilities, to actually deal with the same matter.
I don't think there are any peaceful possibilities of dealing with Saddam. But I totally agree. I mean, the question that still is there, and it's a very difficult question to answer, is, was it worth it removing him, or would it have been better to have left him there? Now, my view in the end is that removing him was very tough for reasons that it's important actually to describe, but leaving him would not have been without consequence.
let's just accept your point that this was all about security. All around the world, independent work is done, also in the Netherlands, about how countries decided to go to war or not to go to war, or whether to support or not. And basically all over the world, the conclusion is that the legal and factual basis to go to war at that point in time, under those circumstances, was probably flawed, because of General Powell's presentation in the Security Council wasn't exactly correct, to put it mildly. The 45 minutes claim was disputable. The link that President Bush assumed between the Hussein regime and Al-Qaeda was not there. I mean, all those claims were falsified, and therefore everybody who independently looked at the decision-making process to go into war decided that maybe that wasn't the right decision at that time under those circumstances. But it hasn't changed your mind.
Well, because I think it's important, you know, what I tried to do in the book is to say to people, I'm not going to persuade you on this at the moment, but just let me try and give you another point of view. You see, there are two basic reasons why people dispute the decision. The one is they say that the evidence was flawed, and plainly the intelligence was flawed, and that's been accepted. It is important, however, when we judge whether he was indeed a threat or not, to look at what the evidence now is, because the Iraq survey group that went into Iraq in 2003 and 2004, after Saddam fell, did an in-depth analysis of exactly what the regime was about, why the intelligence was flawed, what the intentions of Saddam actually were. And it's worth reading, because what that indicates, which is why they conclude that actually he was indeed a threat, was that he made a tactical decision to put his program to get rid of the physical evidence, but he retained the technicians, the scientists, the know-how, and the intent to restart after sanctions, which were, you know, crumbling, frankly, were removed. So, you know, the question I pose to people on the security side is, do we really believe, given the history of Saddam over the previous 10 years, the next 20 would have been different with him and his two sons, one of whom had just been appointed as his successor running Iraq? But the second reason why people are opposed is obviously because it's been so difficult and bloody since then, you know, for all the forces that were involved there. And my point in answer to that is very simple. It is, we removed Saddam after 2 months. Right? From the middle of 2003, foreign troops, including at the time Dutch troops, were there with full United Nations authority, absolutely full authority. Now, what then happened was, the very combination of things we face in Afghanistan today, we face around the whole of the region, in the Middle East, beyond the Middle East, those forces, Iran-sponsored terrorism on the one hand, Al-Qaeda on the other, then sought to destabilize the government, in fact, seek to destabilize it still. Now, my answer to that is, that's a battle that we were, whatever you think about the original decision, that's a battle we are perfectly justified in having and justified in taking on. So, look.
But isn't that also at least partially a problem that you have yourself created?
Oh, this is a great question. I believe that we're still in the middle of this fight. But I don't believe that we have caused this extremism. You know, that's where I differ from some of my friends on the left. They say, look, if George Bush hadn't provoked all this, you know, you hadn't signed up with him, the world would be a safer place. Look, I'm out in the Middle East.
The reason I ask is, you know, going back to the scene from Schindler's List, if your motivation to go to war is so ethical, in a sense of there is injustice, so I have to act, shouldn't there also be a bit more of a pragmatic way of thinking added to that, that you do not only act because you see injustice, but when you act, you also have to think of the consequences. And the consequences of this war are probably that in the region, the world has actually become not safer, but unsafer, and more potential terrorists have come up with, you know, motivation to threaten us. And I agree with you, they were there before the war, obviously. But that problem of terrorism hasn't become smaller.
No, that's true. But here's where I think, this is where I sort of depart from a lot of mainstream opinion. And I think this is why I say the key question of our time is how we deal with this threat. You see, I just don't buy the argument that we provoke these people to do these things. You know, the argument was, the reason why they're committing all these acts of terrorism is because American troops are there in Iraq. Well, first of all, the Iraqi people were allowed to elect their government. Why are these people trying to destabilize that government? But the second thing is, the American troops are now withdrawing, right? They're not stopping the terrorism, right? And that's because the terrorism's got nothing to do with the presence of American troops in Iraq. It's a deliberate attempt to destabilize a government that's democratically elected, because they don't want a democratically elected government. They want a kind of religious theocracy to be put in place there. Now, at some point, in my view, we in the West have got to come to this understanding that this element or strain within Islam is not there because we've caused it. It's not there because we provoked it. It's not there because something we're doing to them is the reason for it. It's we are the reason for it. They don't like us, this extremist element. They don't agree with our way of life, and they want, I'm afraid, to destroy it if they can. And in particular, they want to destroy those regimes in their own countries who are working with us.
You mentioned Iran a couple of times. If you look back at the developments in Iraq and the way the international community dealt with Iraq, what lessons are there to be drawn in terms of how we should deal with Iran?
Well, I actually think that President Obama's drawn the right lesson, which is, and this is why, to go slightly counter to what I've just been saying to you, I mean, I certainly don't believe the solution to this problem is just a hard power solution. You know, this is not something you can solve by military or security means alone. So I think that...
Should it be an option?
You can't take it off the table, because otherwise Iran will say, well, you're not serious about stopping us. But I think Obama's dealt with this in exactly the right way, which is to say to Iran, and he did this in his Cairo speech, really to the Muslim world, he said, okay, I know you think we have disrespected you, that we have not extended the hand of friendship to you. Here is the hand of friendship. But you've got to take it, because it is the will of the international community that Iran should not have nuclear weapons capability. So I think that's the right way to approach it. I think peace between the Israelis and Palestinians is of fundamental importance. I mean, you know, I really think that would make a huge difference to the whole dynamics of this, even though I don't think it, again, that it justifies or causes the extremism. So I think there is a combination of hard and soft power that we can use to defeat this.
But if they don't accept
if they don't accept it, I think you've got to be prepared in the end to leave the military option on the table and to tell them, you have to understand when we say it's unacceptable, it's unacceptable.
Do you still meet George Bush?
I met him a few months back. I still keep in contact with him.
Did you become friends over that period?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was. I know people always used to think, because I was, and I'm a very close friend of Bill Clinton, so I know I'm going to be friends of both, but and they're very different people.
But in your book, you even write you admired him. Well, that surprised a lot of people.
No, it's shocked, I would think, is a more...
Right, so I was trying to be polite, but, you know, okay, shocked, yes.
Yeah, because you see, I think the unresolved question of our times is this question of whether the Bush view, which was very simple and clear and disagreed with by most people, certainly in Europe, I think it's a very open question, far more open than people in Europe think, as to whether history will look back and say, actually, the judgment he made, that the only way of dealing with this is to confront it head on, was the right judgment. And it's very difficult, because conventional wisdom at the moment in Europe is Bush is a...
But I mean, you used the word admiration. I mean, do you understand why many of your political friends, you know, throughout Europe...
I'm sorry about that. I made it very difficult for all my friends.
Disappointed, if not shocked. I mean, you know, you admire Nelson Mandela. You admire maybe Bill Clinton, or, you know, even President Lula, for that matter. But why George Bush?
Because he took a decision that was deeply unpopular. Particularly, I think I use this in respect of the surge in Iraq, which was a turning point there, that I think very few political leaders would have had the courage to take.
George Bush was also the president who defended waterboarding, who defended...
I don't think he would have, actually.
But he did, and he said the Geneva Convention did not apply. I mean, George Bush is also the president who didn't want to take up responsibility for the Kyoto Agreement or the International Criminal Court, you know, who cut the taxes for the wealthy and not for the poor. I mean, politically he was so far away from, you know, what you and I stand for, and still you write about him as if he was the best most admired politician you can think of?
Well, I don't know. I think that's a slight exaggeration, but no, I admire the simplicity and clarity with which he took this decision post 9/11. I mean, look, on plenty of things I disagree with him. Disagree with him on climate change.
And you seem to admire President Bush's leadership because of the fact that he was able to take a decision against what the people thought of it. Is that what you believe the hard core is of modern political leadership? Being able to go against the current?
I think it can be. Yeah, I mean, I think it can. That doesn't mean to say that you just sort of you reward perversity. I mean, someone makes the wrong judgment, they make the wrong judgment. I mean, conventional wisdom can be right often, but I think certainly the biggest test of leadership is always whether you're prepared to do something that you think is right, even though the majority of people may think it's wrong.
Some of your critics wrote that they think that in your vision on leadership, you seem to be concerned more about whether people are able to take a decision and then carry it through in a persistent and determined manner, rather than the question whether it's actually the right decision.
Yeah, and I certainly don't mean to suggest that. Obviously, the most important thing ultimately is whether it's the correct decision or not. But I do think that this presents itself to many leaders, particularly now. What do you actually think? And is that what you are prepared to put before your people? Or do you, in the end, make a calculation about the political margin of maneuver and follow that direction? Now, this is not unfamiliar in politics. This is, where it is.
No, but I mean, it seems to be very close to you as well, because, your book is called A Journey, and many journeys are described in the book. But one of the journeys you describe is the journey from where you started as a prime minister and you wanted to be in touch with the people.
Yeah.
And where you end as a prime minister and you don't seem to care because you believe that your mission is to do what is right, regardless of what the people think.
Well, that would be far too extreme a way of putting it, obviously. I mean, but I think there is this element that is correct, which is that I think what you start to learn when you're in the top job is that ultimately you're not going to please all of the people all of the time. Here's the most difficult, well, you know this, Wouter, from your own experience in politics. The trouble is when people say listen to the people, I always used to say that's a bit of a problem since they're not in agreement. So, I can listen to them, but they're telling me different things. Now, at some point, the job of the leader is to say, okay, I hear what you say and I hear what you say, but this is what I think, and if you like that, that's fine, and if you don't, vote me out.
But the way you write about leadership, it seems to suggest that you believe doubt or hesitation are character traits that don't belong to strong leadership, signs of weakness.
No, I think they do belong to strong leadership. I think if you don't doubt and you don't hesitate, then you're just, you're just foolhardy. So on something like Iraq, for example, I mean, look, what people...
You haven't allowed many people to actually witness you doubting or hesitating about some of the major decisions you took.
Yeah, but that's partly because once you take the decision, in a sense, you don't go out there to explain your doubt, you go out to explain your decision. But truthfully, something like Iraq, but also many of the other decisions, you agonize and you doubt all the time. And people, as I say, forget this now over Iraq, but I worked trying to move mountains in order to get us into a different position and resolve this peacefully. So, I always have said to people, not just in foreign policy, but in other policy as well, yes, of course I doubt and I hesitate. I mean, you should do. But in the end, your job is to lead.
Yeah. The fact that you've described, you started off as somebody who wanted to be in touch with the people, and you ended as a leader who said, I've got to do what is right. Did that also show that your leadership was eroding by the end of your term?
I think isn't this political life in a way?
Well, I'm asking you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're one of the few leaders of a political party that had his party do better at the end than at the beginning. But for most of us, it doesn't work like that. There was a British politician who once said, all political careers end in tears. And look, towards the end, particularly nowadays as well, I think people get fed up with their politicians very quickly. One
of the reasons that you were admired by many had to do with your style of conducting politics, the way you communicated. And from what I read from your book, you believe that's an essential part of political leadership, to an extent that you introduced spin doctors in Downing Street and all that. Has that been good for politics?
Look, the thing about so-called spin doctors, I mean, if you're in modern politics today with a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week media and the proliferation of media that there's been, if you don't have a decent press operation, forget it. You are toast.
But this was not just press operation.
Well,
this was about framing. This was about shaping your own reputation.
I know, but you know, this is the notion that I was the first politician ever to think about how you framed your reputation or your strategy. I mean, you know, I always used to say this is what they say about progressive politicians to make us nervous about being professional, right? When Mrs. Thatcher hired the best ad agency in the UK and ran a brilliant campaign against Labour in 1979, everyone said, oh, that's fantastic, well done. You know, when I employed the best press operation in, you know, people say, oh, it's terrible. Look how monstrous you are to try and, you know, frame your...
How much of modern politics is about effective communication?
In the information age, a lot.
Too much?
Yeah, too much. Too much. I mean, I'm absolutely. I think.
I mean, how much is left of the competition between great ideas that some say politics should be
well,
about?
It's a really good point, Wouter, because I think that politics today is in danger of, at the level of policy, just becoming a battle of headlines. You know, how many people?
And can that be resisted, or do you have to go with the flow?
It's a very good question. I don't know.
You decided to go with the flow.
I actually, towards the end, I was far more trying to counter it, but it's incredibly difficult. And the relationship, the whole issue to do with democracy today, I think, is a big, big topic for us in the West, because what we think is, provided you've got universal suffrage and everyone votes in an election, that's democracy. Well, of course it is the foundation of democracy. But the relationship, for example, between politics and the media today, I think is really, really difficult. It's a big subject. We never debate it. The question of how you attract a sufficient pool of talent into politics today, when politicians are supposed to be professional politicians from the age of 12, you know, that's a big question. We don't really debate it. And partly because of the relationship with the media, what we find in our country, I don't know about yours, but politics is too much about sort of scandal and, you know, this big blah in the newspapers and another, and the actual discussion of policy when in fact what decides a country's future is policy, not communication, is far more limited than it should be in my view. But
so how do you counter that trend?
I don't know. I think the first thing is that you surface it as a debate. You know, if you look at American politics today, it's really become a battle of headlines. And if you can't sum it up in 15 seconds, never mind a minute, forget it. No one's going to listen. Now, that is...
And somehow progressive politicians always find that more difficult than conservatives or liberals.
Of course, and that's why the progressives so often get beaten, because you particularly over issues like immigration or what I would call sort of gut issues with the public, where you can get people angry very quickly. The right always have the best lines, and the left's got to come back with some very strong stuff to counter it. It can do, incidentally. I think the left collectively made a big mistake in many different parts of the world in believing that the financial crisis, actually, in fact, you kind of avoided that more here, I think, that the financial crisis brought the state back into fashion. And I think it's not quite like that. When the state came in to refinance the banks and stabilize the financial system, people were totally in support of that. What they then didn't support was the way we took out of the financial crisis. And our election in the UK, in my view, was far more a traditional tax and spending election than you would know.
But I mean, you describe how Gordon Brown, as a prime minister, played his role to save the country, if you like, during the financial crisis. And I saw him at work during the G20 meetings and all that, and it was very impressive. But wasn't he, in a way, also one of the people who actually caused the financial crisis? Because wasn't it an integral part of the new Labour programme to liberalise and deregulate financial markets, especially in the city? I mean, you were proud of what happened in the city.
Yeah, and we didn't actually deregulate the city. This is a slight myth, but it's true that we didn't tighten up regulation. We, in accordance with most governments at the time, we didn't spot this financial crisis coming. But the point I make in my book is, this idea of a sort of blame game, you know, who is it? The banks, the politicians? Look, every part of the system failed. The regulators failed, the politicians failed, the monetary authorities failed. And actually, let's not kid ourselves about this. People were going out and taking out, you know, loans and wanting to do that. My view is that is just a mug's game. You know, who's to blame for it? The fact of the matter is, people didn't spot it. Right. Now, how we get out of the financial crisis is incredibly important. I think you need the state to stabilize the situation, but in the end, it will be the private sector and the enterprise and creativity and innovation of businesses that will really lead us back to strong growth.
But do you believe, after the crisis, that your story about the strength of the market and market economy needs to be revised? Ed Miliband seems to suggest that one of the things that the Labour Party, under his leadership, has got to rethink is the way that the Labour Party thinks about markets.
Yeah, but then my answer to people on the left on that, and you know, I think Ed very sensibly has now said he's going to govern from the centre and so on. Just be careful of this. I mean, why is the left not winning elections all over Europe?
You tell me.
Well, I think because we made the mistake in believing that the state was back in fashion. And actually, in today's world, where a majority of people are taxpayers and believe that they will fund the state in the end, and also with the post-war experience, they believe that the state is itself a vested interest, right? Which is not to say they don't need it, but they have a different concept of the state today. And that concept of the state has got to be about empowerment and not control. In other words, you know, what I always say to my friends in progressive politics is, look, just analyze how people live, first of all. Forget politics. Just go out and see how they live with their iPhones and their Blackberries, and now will be the generation of the iPad and all the rest of it. Look at the choices they live. Look at the types of work they do. Look at the type of education that they want today. A sort of one-size-fits-all, centralized, statist view of the world, it's gone. Now, the values of the progressives haven't gone. It's just that we need to reinvent the concept of government for today's world.
Thank you. Do you actually have you found time to see your family more often after you've left active politics, or is that still a battle?
Yeah, it is still a battle, I'm afraid, yes. Because as my wife points out to me, that you used to give me, she said, I know you're a politician, but you used to give me this line when you were in office. Don't worry, it'll all be different when I finish. You will find the same, I think.
Well, thank you for the warning. How old are your children now?
My three oldest are 26, 24, and 22.
So has any of them come up to you yet and asked you whether he should become Prime Minister?
No, none have asked that.
And if they would, what would you advise them?
First of all, I advise them never set out with the aim of being Prime Minister. I never did. And you just don't. If it happens, it happens. If you decide you're interested in politics, that's another matter. But people who want from a very early age to be Prime Minister, in my experience, A, don't become Prime Minister, and B, probably shouldn't anyway.
And if they ask you, Dad, did it make you a better man? What will you tell them?
Don't think so, really. I mean, I think what makes you a better man is probably not a life in politics.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wouter. Thank you.